Welcome everyone to another episode of the Terrain Studio. I'm your host, Sean Morris. Today on the Terrain Studio, I'm going to show you how to recreate some of the venting that I featured on both the Endor and the Scarif bunkers that you may have seen featured on the Fantasy Flight website. For the purposes of this tutorial, we're going to be working with just a few materials, primarily polystyrene or plastic card, if you are so inclined to refer to it as that. I like plastic card or polystyrene because it's a very malleable material. You can manipulate it quite easily, and with very few sort of variations in it, you can create a lot of varied elements. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to be working with this single piece of polystyrene here. It is 3mm polystyrene, so it's quite a thick piece, and I'm going to use this to create various styles of venting. Initially in the video, you're going to see me just doing a number of cuts. That'll be sped up just because the process takes a little while to cut through the 3mm, but let me just walk you through what exactly you're going to see. I'm going to be removing this large rectangular section here, this triangular section here, this elongated rectangular section here, and this smaller rectangle here. Each of those are going to provide us with the 4 elements that we're going to work on in this tutorial. We're going to be doing some venting here, some flaps that are going to press into the negative space. We're going to be doing a grid or grate style venting here, and we're just going to use this angled section to kind of show you how you can vary venting so it doesn't all have to be sort of uniform and mechanical in structure. We're going to be using some negative space here so I can show you how to recess elements in an otherwise flat piece of material. We're also going to add a few accoutrements here to just sort of elevate or lift the surface and give you that more 3-dimensional shape in this otherwise 2-dimensional plane. And then we're going to add in here a very small, tight grid, more like a fan or an exhaust vent, and we're going to be using some rolled plastic card here or rod-like structure. So the tools that we're going to work with are pretty simple. I use a ruler, however you'll typically see me only have the ruler flipped over this way. I don't usually use any measurements because I like to use spacers, and by spacers I mean I like to use existing structures to create the lines. I like the uniformity of the space always being the same, and I just use those to gauge the depths that I want to work with. I don't usually do a lot of measurements because I like to lay out elements that look aesthetically pleasing rather than fit the space. Of course, I have to work within the constraints that I have. In this particular case, it's this piece here. I'll be using some pencils. I just have 2 just in case one runs out, and unless I lose it, which I usually do, underneath the various bits and bobs, I like to have another one on hand. So a pencil's fine. You can have a pair of sprue cutters or plastic cutters. However, the reason I show this is because you may not have a different tool. Typically what I do is I use something called the chopper. I think this is the chopper 2, 2.0 version. It's basically a straight razor blade here on this sort of pivoting arm that comes down and makes fairly straight cuts. However, I would say that you get a little blade deflection if your material's super thick. That's why I'm actually cutting this piece here with the knife and not with the chopper. However, it doesn't get into these spaces anyway, so it wouldn't be a usable tool. However, if you don't have that, you can certainly use sprue cutters, or you could just use a knife. So that's basically all the materials that I need for this, in addition to the polystyrene. I'm going to be using various strips and sort of different shapes. However, if you only have flat plastic or polystyrene, you can certainly cut almost every shape that I'm going to show you here. Just for the purposes of this, and because I have it on hand, I'll be using a few different styles, and I'll certainly explain all of those for you. So just enjoy the next 30 seconds or a minute of me cutting. It's going to definitely be sped up, but I will nonetheless show you every part of this. So let's get started. Okay, so that was a lot of cutting, but I think we're ready now for the next step. So if you watched the entire sped up process, you'll notice that it takes a lot of scoring cuts around each of the sides to get through the 3 mil. 3 mil is incredibly thick. However, I like it for basically my first layer. If you're building things out of 3 mil polystyrene, you can almost do a wall this big without having any additional supports. Typically what I'll do is I'll laminate this onto a piece of foam core. So just foam core from like a dollar store or an art store. And the foam core with the addition of this stuff is really thick. It just lacks a little bit of rigidity over a long surface. However, the foam core is enough to give it some rigidity, and then you have the protective element and layer of the polystyrene. So the reason it took so many cuts is because the knife can only plunge so deep. You'll also notice that I took a sanding stick. I use that to clean up any of the flash or any of the corners, just to sort of reshape and redefine those. So you can do that with a knife. However, I find that using a sanding stick is quite nice. It doesn't need to be perfect. Like here, I notice that there's a bit of unevenness, and that's just because as you're scoring, the blade actually has a little deflection. So it's really hard to keep a blade that's this narrow, this thin, straight. So what happens is you try to do it in scoring motions so that you're not putting a lot of deflection. But those last few cuts, you're going to start to get, particular because your knife is plunging, you're going to start to get a little deflection from your hand, which is perfectly fine. It's going to be minuscule. However, if you can clean it up a little bit with a sanding block or sanding stick like I did, it's a little better off. So now we have what we're working with. I guess this is going to be kind of straighter for you this way, but it doesn't really matter. These are vents, so they could be inverted. There's not going to be any direction to them until we actually put in the flaps. The flaps will kind of have a downward direction. So when I'm building that, I'll probably build it towards me, but I'll rotate it around so you can kind of see what that looks like. So we're all ready. We got basically our core structure, and now we can start doing the other elements. Definitely don't chuck out your sort of negative cuts, or the negative space that you cut out. These could be certainly used for other things. I have a bin that I keep all kinds of scraps. When they get particularly small, I chuck them. I usually get this stuff in 2x3 sheets, so it starts pretty big, and then I just sort of continually cut it down until it's almost unusable. But you can usually find a use for many pieces, so until I'm completely finished, I'm just going to set those aside. Never know, I could use them. All right, well, let's get started with one of the more simple ones that we're going to do, as I just sort of like to check the corners, redefine the corners, and I do so with a knife, typically just reshaping. It's going to be all awash in the end. So what we're going to do for this first one is we're going to use some plastic rod. Now this stuff is very narrow. It is in fact a rod and not a square. You can get this in squares, you can get it in hollow tubes, hollow squares, L shapes, H shapes, I beams. You can get it in all kinds of dimensions and formations. And the company that I typically order this stuff from is let me go this way, Evergreen Scale Model. If you just search Evergreen Plastics, you're going to come up. The site is a little bit hard to navigate because a lot of the images are the same. They use basic images like this, and then you're going to have a bunch of measurements in both metric and imperial. So if you know particularly what you're looking for, then you can certainly go on there and find it. If you can find this in shops, the best way to kind of tell is just looking by eye. It's all clear packaging, so you can see this is L shape here, and this is 3.2 or 1/8 of an inch L shape. We're going to use this to do one of the ventings later. I don't have the package for this rod, but it is particularly small. It's about 1 mil in basic diameter, so it's fairly small. So what we're going to do with this is we're going to actually lay the rods into this space here, and we're going to want to cut them as close as we can so that we have a glue surface on both sides. We're going to then end up hiding the edge as well as all the cuts with a small veneer that we're going to put over the outside. So if you don't get it quite right, that's fine. Another way you can do this if you don't feel comfortable doing that is you can actually glue the rods all the way across the back surface, so joining from here to here. What that's going to do though is it's going to create your overall wall thickness to be a little bit thicker, and so if you're doing that, you'll have to account for the fact that this won't sit necessarily flush. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to try to cut them to fit in between, and then we'll do a veneer on the outside so we can kind of keep this at least one surface completely flat. So again, for this, I'm probably going to speed this up. I'm going to make a bunch of redundant cuts all to this particular shape. If in fact I wanted to know what the measurement was, these pads, by the way, are exceptionally handy to work on because you can lay them out. They have lots of grid and point references as well as measurements. So if you're working from a corner, you kind of set that down and you can sort of figure out what you're working on. So if you don't have one of these, I recommend this one's by Fiskars. I have a whole bunch of others by Hobbico and all kinds of different companies, but you can find these pads readily available at most craft stores. Even some dollar stores will sell smaller versions. So for this particular one here, it looks to be roughly about 13 millimeters. Let me check the bottom measurement, and we're right about on 13 millimeters. So I'll probably go ahead and cut most of these at 13. I'll lay them in and then we'll come back. So we're going to speed this part of the video up as well. Yeah, so that looks particularly nice in terms of fitting in there. So there's the venting, and it is recessed, as you guys can see there. So it's pretty simple, and it gives a nice grid effect. Once we go ahead and add some paint, all the little teeny gaps will be hidden. If you got anything that's sort of popped up, not setting down at this point, you can still just use something strong to sort of press that in. What we're also going to be able to do too is if it's not sitting completely flush on the back at this point, we can just take our sanding stick, and I'm just going to give that a sand. And there we go. So everything's nice and recessed. So we're not finished with this though at this point. What we need to do now is remove this guy who's sticking down. We're going to go in now and we're going to create a little bit of a veneer to cover up our sort of end pieces here, where it's not particularly nice looking. Each piece is a little bit different in size, so it's got a little bit of variation, but we can go ahead and clean a lot of that up. What we're going to do for that is we're going to use some different size plastic cards. So this is a little bit thinner. This, to me, I don't have the size on me, but this looks to be around 0.5 mil, so 0.5. 0.5 and 1 are typically the two that I work with the most. I just particularly like those because they can often be cut through with a single pass of the knife or 2 scores, and they're not so thick that they have a lot of 3-dimension. However, they definitely give that look of being a raised panel with not having super high edges, not something that you need to round over. In this particular case, I'm going to do a measurement. So we're looking at roughly from top to bottom, it's just over 1 inch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this at around 1 3/8 inches for my overall height. So again, you can see I've previously cut obviously some circular items out of this. So I'm just going to mark off 1 3/8 inches. This doesn't need to be a super precise measurement because we are going to do we're just basically looking for an overlay at this point. And so now what I'm going to do is just square off this piece. And so there's not a lot of math involved, but there is certainly a lot of measurement and cutting. So if that's not really your thing, you probably will greatly dislike scratch building. However, it's one of my favorite elements of terrain making, and so I have particular enjoyment gained from scratch building. And I like just try to kind of making something out of nothing. So you're going to see we really truly started with a bunch of flat plastic, and I'm just going to not even measure to square this off, just cut it. And by the end of it, we're going to have you know, a panel with a few vents. So now we have a piece that's definitely going to fit over the end, so that's fine. And now what we want to do is figure out a rough width for this. Let's just see here. So edge to edge, we're looking just under 3/4 of an inch. So I think if we go, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, let's say we go 7/8 of an inch. I think that should give us a roughly adequate piece. I'm just going to put my measurement on there and just sort of check that. Yeah, I think that'll be fine. So let's go up to the top here. 7/8 of an inch-ish. There. Great. Again, we'll square that off. I'm just using this piece of plastic card as a nice backing strip. Just gives me something to flush up my ruler against. If you have a small T-square, that would also work adequately. Just gonna go ahead and score this. Yeah, I think that works fine. All right, so that's gonna go over our panel. However, now what we need to do is we need to open back up the panel space. So for this, I'm going to use my eye. I'm going to go just inside of those two measurements. And I'm going to go bottom to top. I'm going to go just inside these measurements. So what I'm doing is I'm measuring the exact extreme of the panel, knowing that I want to leave a little bit of perimeter because I want the edges to be again covered. So just going to go back in with the guide here. Just going to come inside of that panel a little bit. There we go. Same thing on the other side. Again, I'm just eyeballing these because they're such fine measurements that the eye's probably not going to pick up most of this. I think that'll be right. I might come in a little bit tighter on that one. Of course, you can be as precise as you like. If I was building something like to scale, and I was really concerned about maintaining a particular ratio of one element to another, in that case, I would probably pay close attention to what it is I was measuring. However, in this particular case, because I'm just sort of making up the elements, I'm fine to just sort of work with a little bit more discretion, or indiscretion, I guess would be in this case. I got a little bit more room to play. All right, so we're gonna go with that. I think that looks all right. pretty good there. So what we're going to do is we're going to lay this over our vent. There we go. Eyeball up the measurement. Looks pretty good. Let me go ahead and add a little bit of super glue on the back of this. Okay, not going too much. Take a scrap piece of plastic card. You don't want to have a lot of build up because it'll squeeze out the edges, and we're trying to avoid that. Like I said, you can use that for several things. You can use it for weld lines later. You can use it for environmental elements build up, and you can use it for sort of adding to your weathering effect. So, which again would be kind of more either mechanical or natural weathering elements. Might have taken a little too much off the top here, so I'm just going to put a little bit more down. There we go. Press that into place, and that looks like it's supposed to. So don't let the, let me use my eraser here, don't let the lines on the panel fool you. I'm just going to take those off so that you guys can get a little better sense. The pencil lines will sometimes throw you off a little bit because they're not necessarily in line with the element that you made. But there is our panel. So it's recessed now. It's got a little bit of depth, so you can see there that it's recessed in, and it's got enough of a tight fitness that you like a tight fit here that you can't see my finger through that, so we know that it's fairly solid, and it is definitely vent-like in structure. So that is just one, like I said, fairly quick and easy element that makes an otherwise flat panel now look quite three-dimensional. So we have this one done. We're going to now move to another example. So let's go in and tackle this next one here. So for this one, we're going to use an L shape or an angle piece of plastic card, and this is the one that I talked about, the 1/8. And this is what it looks like here. So it's just, again, L shape. We're going to actually use it in this formation here. So the point, the sort of the corner, is going to be facing upward. So it's going to go in like this. And the reason being is that when we lay subsequent ones together, it gives us this really nice venting type look. We'll have almost like these become flaps. You can actually use them inverted as well if you like. If you use them inverted this way, you'll get a different style venting. So on the Scarif one, I actually use them slightly off. I actually use them angled and open to create sort of open flaps. But for the purposes of this tutorial, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use them flat like this. It's going to give you a very closed vent, but definitely a vent-like appearance. We're going to do this very similar to how we did the rods. We're going to, again, fit them into our cavity. We're going to, here we have a 60-degree angle. So what we're going to have to end up doing is coming in and just angling this out. I'm going to use the chopper to do that, just to kind of assist. But again, if you don't get them perfect, we'll use a veneer on the outside. And the reason I use the veneers is because it adds depth to an otherwise flat surface. So this will be fairly straightforward. It's a significantly less cuts. That's the only downside about doing this very tight venting, is that you have a significant number of pieces. Everything from here on out will have less pieces, and there'll be larger elements. However, I really do like the look that this achieves. So for this, what we're going to do is we're going to go in and we're going to start marking off how the vents are going to, what length we kind of need. So again, what I'll do here is sort of mark off the pieces just crudely. For simplicity's sakes, I'm just going to freehand the cuts, because I think it'll be a little bit more in line with what you guys will need to be doing. So Again, I'm just going to lay it right down on here. It's just going to be awkward to explain the angling on there, so you can see I can achieve a fairly straight forward fit with just freehanding in each cut. Now this one here, you're going to notice there's going to be a couple things. One, when you lay this on a flat surface, you're going to get a little bit of vaulting here. Particularly when you angle cut, you're going to get a significant vault. So we're going to need to take care of that. And we're going to do that with a veneer. We're going to do that veneer a little bit different than we did this one. But however, let's go ahead and just finish up each of these pieces. Now the beauty is, once I create that first cut, I can inevitably just use that, reverse the piece around, use a similar style cut, and now I'm making a 90-degree cut here, or just basically a flush cut. So there. So this is why I was saying about the chopper. I'm going to have to angle. I'm going to have to switch back and forth continuously to make the cuts, and that's just going to be too awkward here. So I'll do just each of the cuts by hand. Same thing with these. I'm going to want to make sure that each subsequent one is working in conjunction with the previous one. So I might just have to do a bit of trimming here and there. I want to make sure that the pieces are laying flush enough and not crowding out each of the subsequent next or joining pieces. So in this case here, just had to angle the end a little bit better so that I can get the neighboring piece to sit flush. So there we go. Then we're going to go back to the next one. Okay, so now we have the next venting all set in and cut. You could see me making the cuts. You'll also notice that I had to do a little bit of manufacturing here at the bottom, just having to cut off half of one side in order to sort of finish that gap in. If in pre-planning you knew exactly what you were going to do, I could have, of course, laid out 7 of these and made sure that my particular shape was exactly the width of 7 of those. I didn't do that. I didn't exactly know what venting I wanted to use, but nonetheless, I have it laid in. Now, I talked before about having to lay a veneer over this. However, what I managed to do was I managed to press it in far enough that you can now see that that gap I talked about on the side is no longer there. So if I go and grab a piece of this, if this was just laid flush onto a panel that wasn't 3mm, you would have ended up having ends that look like that, and that wouldn't have looked necessarily very real for a vent. However, if I laid it into a 3mm, which I did here, it ends up covering the end. So I'm actually going to avoid the veneer here entirely. I have, however, got ends here that maybe isn't the most perfect or amazing looking finish here, and that's just due to the fact that you're going to have different angled cuts, and you're going to have various sanding elements and things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and lay in not a full veneer, but I'm going to go lay in a panel, and I'm going to use stripping to do this. And what that's going to do is give me a nice finished look around this element. So this is, again, very straightforward. What I will want to do is probably use stripping that maybe is a little bit narrower. So just because at the end here I'm going to have to do a little bit of a trim, which is fine. So what you need to do here is you need to decide where you want your angles or how you want your angles to meet. Do I want it to run down here and then have a bisecting angle there? Do I want to run this all the way down and actually have the angle cut here, and I think in this particular case what I'm going to use is I'm going to use the 60 degree the 30 degree, I call it 60, no it's 60, sorry, the 60 degree angle here as my first piece, and then I'll have both of my cuts sort of angling off this way. So for here I'm going to just simply create some markings. There we go, and then I'm going to lay on my ruler and I'm going to just go ahead and make those cuts. In this case here I can just sort of bend that off, that's good. So that first one's going to run down there, and then what I'm going to use is just another piece of this, and just to ensure, okay, in fact, yeah, that looks good. That's going to run off the end there, so I'm going to want to make sure that I replicate that cut. For these types of cuts, because it's fairly easy to bend and break, what I'll often do is I will start gluing these in place, maybe not necessarily all the way down the full length, because I don't have it all cut at this point. However, I like to use each subsequent cut to help with the next one. So in this particular case, I'm going to lay this along there. I'm going to angle this up to the top, and although it's just going to be sort of tacked in place at this point, I can go back in and lay some more glue. So I'm just going to use that first one. It's just tacked here in place in the corner. I'm going to grab this next piece of veneer, lay it over where I want it to. There we go. Use that. Use the ruler to sort of extend down this piece here. There we go. Use my knife, score in that cut, and this just becomes a lot better than measuring with or marking with a pencil, taking it off, going back, cutting it, because there's a lot more room for error the more times that I move something. So now I have this piece. There we go. So we are getting there. We have one vent here, and it's a little bit hard with the overhead cam, but you'll see some different images later. But so there you go. Got that washboard style. We have the smaller one down here. You guys can hear that. And we have one particular one left to create here, and then we're going to just do a negative panel for this one. So what we'll end up doing is just taking a very thin piece, because again we want to maintain that threshold on the back, and we'll go ahead and lay that in, and that'll just give you an idea that you can do some recessed work that's not necessarily venting. Maybe have some control panels, or some screens, or even some piping laid in there, and I'll show you a few little things that you can kind of do to an otherwise simplistic panel. So you can see how that flash is really cleaned up the outside of that edge. Again, we had the panel here, left a little room at the top if we wanted to add a few bolts or things like that. But this back panel is super easy, so we'll go ahead and lay that in next. For that, I'm actually going to be using the plastic that I've been using as my backing strip. So this stuff is super thin. You'll notice here that I can actually tear that just with my fingers. So that's how thin that is. It's about actually, I think this is, I want to say maybe a 32nd of an inch thick. Those are 30 seconds there. So yeah, this is 1/32 of an inch thick. So very, very thin, almost like a cardstock like paper. So this this step we're going to do is going to be like stupidly simple. We're going to effectively lay it over our space. We're going to cut a shape that is going to be just slightly larger than what we need. And so for here, I'm just going to, and we won't worry about the fact that I got some glue on the back of this, because we'll just, that'll be the back side. So I'm just going to mark off there and there, just to give us a little bit of gluing area. We'll make a very simplistic cut, basically square it off. So you'll notice that that's a light score, and 2 bends and you're done with that. So that is how easy this stuff is to work with. So I'm scoring, I'm not even cutting there. Boom, 2 bends and you're done. So that will definitely fit over there, and then we'll leave us a little bit of room to glue here. Oh, just make that really simple cut there. Score that down. There we go. All right, let me just scoot a couple things to the side here. Starting to get cluttered. I told you I would have this space looking disastrous before we were finished. All right, so haven't lost any pencils yet though, so that's a bonus. So we're just gonna double check that. There we go. And because it's so thin, like I said, when you flip this over, that's gonna be insignificant in terms of thickness. So here what I want to do is I'm going to lay my glue right down, and I want to make this go a little bit further out with your application, and then take something that you can spread the glue out with. In this case, I'm just going to use and again, this is very thin piece of plastic, so it doesn't require a ton of hold. So it's pretty simple. It just saves me having to clean up anything on the side. So there we go. Just a recessed panel, nothing special. But that's going to allow us to do a few other pieces around here, and we'll get to that in a minute. So we have 3 out of 4 of the basic elements done for part 1. I'm only going to do these 4 elements. We will revisit this and do some more work in subsequent how-tos, but let's get to the, let's say, the more complex of the panels, and I use complex in a sort of a loose way. I don't really truly think it's that particularly difficult of a step. It does have a few more measurements involved. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a little bit thinner stuff. So again, this is very similar to what we just used, and the reason we want to use this one is because we want to take advantage of the bendable type elements that this allows. So we want to do some bending and not necessarily cutting. So for this, what we're going to do is we're going to trace out a usable piece, and this is the idea of kind of the sheets that I get to make this work. Or sorry, how I kind of purchase them to sort of make some of these bigger elements. It's nice to have a little bit of a larger piece to work with. So all I'm doing here is I'm marking off an area that I would like to cut out to work with. And this just gets us our starting piece. To back this, and we should be able to make do with this section. I'm just going to give this one 2 cuts because I want to make sure that I get a nice clean piece. All right, and that is our starting structure. So again, it's like it's a backing strip. However, we're going to use this in a slightly different manner. We're actually going to use this on the front facing and use some bendable flaps to flex in to the cavity. So in this case, we're kind of working opposite of what we've been doing. We're going to work on the outside of the cavity and use the cavity to our advantage in terms of a negative space. Here we sort of filled the cavity to refill and create a positive space. So for this, what we need to do is we need to be a little bit cognizant of the front side that we're working with and how much of the front we want to cover. So I'm just going to eyeball this. That seems to be appropriate. And I'm going to trim down this piece to fit. And we may take a little bit more off this as we go, but we're going to start working this down into a more manageable section. If you guys don't mind, I'm just going to really quickly swap out my knife blade. So one thing that I can give you for advice is to make sure that you have very sharp blades when working with polystyrene. The unfortunate part is that it will dull your blades particularly quickly. The reason I want to have a nice sharp blade for this is you'll see in a few minutes when we start doing the flaps is they need to be precisely cut. And the score lines need to be just so deep that you can flex without cutting through, and that's achieved primarily with a sharp blade. So I just usually buy like 15 packs of blades. It's got a dispensary here for the new ones and a depository here for the old ones. So it's just kind of a compact way. You don't end up with blades in the garbage can, and children or pets or things like that end up getting cut. So everything gets disposed in here. When I'm all done, I just chuck this entire container out. All right, so again, working from the front side, and what I'm just looking to do is just to square up the shape. So I got to do a little bit more trimming top and bottom because I don't have a lot of wiggle room on this particular piece. So as I said, it's probably the most technical. At this point, I'm just getting it to fit the working space, and so that's all I'm doing here. I'm just squaring everything up to ensure that it fits. A little bit of excess on the bottom, so I'm going to take that off as well. There we go. Okay, so I think we are about as square and flush on all edges as we are going to be. It's a little hard to see how much space I have, but if I slide this down, you can see here that I'm just a little bit over on this edge, and I have a little bit more room on this edge. I may end up just splitting the difference slightly as we get going here, but I want to start cutting in the flaps. So for this, what I need to do, I should have a little bit of tape. That would be quite handy for me. I'm just going to grab a little bit of painter's tape here, just so that I can secure one edge without creating any issues. So there we go. Excellent. Yeah, I think that'll work. All right, so now what I need to do is I need to trace the inside cavity, and I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. Let me pop that off. This is going to define my workspace. So the flaps can obviously not be any larger than this because there's no cavity for the flap to flex into, and there can be no more flex than 3 mil. So I need to make sure that I cut the flaps adequately enough that I can achieve the look of sort of a flexed in flap. Like what I want to do is I want to effectively flex in this so that I can create each subsequent flap, and then have another little bit of a piece above that, and then a flap, and then a piece, and then a flap, and it'll become a little bit more clear as we get going. So and now we have laid in what we were looking to achieve. So we have buffer, flap, buffer, flap, buffer, flap, buffer, flap, and small buffer at the top. That works for me. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have the cuts for the flaps are going to be like this. We're going to cut this edge, and this edge. And what that's going to allow us to do is detach from the upper strip. We can then fold in using this line. So this line right here, let me just dot this for video's sake. This dotted line becomes our flap, where we're going to flex the flap in. And that's going to allow us to flex in as far back as 3 mil. And so what we'll do is we'll work those, and again, you're not cutting this, but what we are going to do is we're going to score this, and the difference between cutting and scoring is basically knife pressure. You want to make sure that you get a nice clean line that you can fold on. You can almost get a pressure cut through there, and that's where you start to turn the plastic a little bit white. You've probably overextended a piece of plastic on a sprue or something like that and have seen that before. But just to be clear, we're cutting these 3 and we're flexing this one. So let's go ahead and just start with that. Now, here's where we're going to want to be very clean with our cuts, because we want to make sure that we are not cutting anything that we don't want a cut line on. And because this is going to be on the front facing, it's going to be very prominent if we so choose to do that. I guess we wouldn't choose to cut, but we would have that unfortunate incident of having a cut there. Okay, so that one's cut. That one's cut. Move this on camera a little bit more. There we go. And that one's cut. Okay. So I'm not going to flex that just yet. I'm going to cut all of these and then we'll go in and do the flaps. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go in, now that we have all the flaps sort of cut out and defined here, now what we're going to do is we're going to go in and do the score lines for these. So what we want to do is, this is our front side here where we have all the pencil lines, and just kind of reorient you guys to where we were. That's going to go on here. Sorry, it's going to go on this way. Then turn this for you guys, and then what we're going to do is we're actually going to flex all of those flaps inside here. So what we want to do now is we want to go to the back side, and we're going to want to cut in those score lines for the flaps themselves. So we can do this one of two ways. So you can have your flaps be flexed in, or you can have your flaps flexed out. It's depending on how you want your vents. Do you want your vents to have the opening towards the bottom, or do you want your vents to have the opening towards the top? And that's truly up to you. So the difference being, I guess, is that when you're looking at it, if the flap is flexed in, there's an opening right here, and then sort of you don't see into the flap itself. If you have the flap, let's say, the other way, we basically would have had to cut it the other way. You could have your flaps actually open, as in like you're looking underneath the flap itself. So for this build right here, obviously I've done it so that it's going to flex in and there's going to be opening here, but just letting you know that if you just cut it the other way and you have your score line along the top, you can flex your panels the other way. So maybe you want to have one in and one out. That's completely up to you. So what we need to do now is we need to cut in the score lines. So we need to mark off, in this particular case, where that score line needs to be. And so we're going to need to mark off using our gauges roughly where that is going to be positioned. So I'm just going to use, again, a couple gauges. Just to bring this a little bit more towards you guys. Set this first one down, and there we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mark in this first line so that I can verify before I go ahead and score that. Yes, that in fact is going to be where I want it. So let me do this, and it's a bit of a delicate process. And I'm also going to cut my or just define my outside edges so that I know where my score is going to go. Make sure your knife is nice and sharp. You're going to line up your ruler there, and all you're going to do is just let the weight of the knife cut that line in. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, again, in this particular case, I want to flex it in. So I'm going to go on the back side and I'm going to flex it towards me. And I'm going to use my ruler as my sort of flex point, and I'm going to flex the flap. So side on profile, it looks like that. It is not broken. Front on profile, it's very subtle, but there's a little bit of a stress point. And then you can kind of see there exactly how far I flexed it. I have flexed it further than it can be flexed. And the reason I say that is because when I go ahead and lay it into my my panel, you're going to see that it in fact has flexed past the 3 mil. So this will settle out to be a little less deep, but nonetheless it's going to look pretty sharp. So let me just finish up the rest of the flexes and then we'll come back. So now we're back here with the 4 flaps now defined. You can sort of see them flexed in there on the front. Again, it's a little subtle, it's white on white, but maybe there you can see sort of how the panels look. So this would be basically looking from the bottom up. You can see that is side on profile there. But more importantly, when we lay it onto our actual panel, it should start to look, there we go, you can start to see maybe just a little bit, how that creates a paneled look. So let me go ahead and glue this in place. And for that, I'm basically just going to run a bead of glue around the perimeter of this. There we go. And then I'm going to go ahead and lay the flaps in. I want to line up basically one corner. This piece is a little bit more forgiving because the flaps themselves will sort of only go one way. Just have to get this to line up at the bottom here. I might just need to do a little bit of trimming at the top. Yeah, I think that works. Let's get that press in place. Just to recap here, we got the nice sort of exhaust venting here. We have the sort of larger flaps here. Maybe you can envision these sort of opening or turning and twisting. Here we just created a negative panel space so we can go ahead and go do some work in there after. And then of course, here we have the very iconic flaps featured on both the end door and the scarif bunkers. And so probably the most technical in terms of you have to be a little bit more careful. Here, obviously, a little bit of geometry and a little bit of trim cleanup. This one is difficult in the sense that you have to cut lots of small parts, but fairly straightforward in application. And this one, of course, is the easiest of all. Just basically cut out a space and then put a little backing strip in. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed that. We'll come back and we'll do some more work with this panel going forward. What we'll do first and foremost is we'll add a little bit more trim elements to make it look a little bit more mechanical, and then what we'll do is we'll go in and we'll do very simplistic painting. We'll modulate it up, we'll do some weathering, some streaking grime, some things like that, and we'll get it kind of looking like a very worn or well-used panel. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this tutorial from the Terrain Studio. I'm your host, Sean Morris. Of course, if you want to go ahead and slide over to the Patreon page, you can see a few more tutorials like this. The number of tutorials is increasingly growing. They're not all scratch building. Some of them are more natural elements. Some of them are working with different products that you may or may not have had experience with. But that's one of the beauties about watching somebody use stuff. You don't need to run out and grab it unless it's going to work for you. So as always, really appreciate this. This is going to be posted on Facebook and YouTube. So if you want to go ahead and like or subscribe on whatever platform you're seeing it, that would be incredibly helpful to me. So until next time, guys, thanks for watching. Cheers.